Hello and welcome back to my channel. I'm talking today about the Bradford murders, which is also known as the crossbow cannibal case. This story begins in Homefield Court, which is in Bradford, West Yorkshire. The building's caretaker is reviewing the CCTV, which is done routinely every 48 hours or so, and he makes a shocking discovery. However, the events he uncovered actually began well over a year before. Susan Rushworth was 43 years old and had been working in Bradford in the red light district for around 3 years. Her brother Paul, who she was very close to, spoke about her in a documentary, and he said that they got on really well. They were really close together in age, I think about 18 months between them. And they had a stable, happy upbringing and lived in the countryside. She was married in her early 20s. She had a family, 2 children, everything was going great until her marriage broke down. And in her 30s, she found love again with a new partner, and they had another baby together. And just as she was feeling settled, it happened again. Her boyfriend left her. She was heartbroken for the second time. At 35, she was now a single mother to 3 children. Eventually, she became so depressed, she turned to drugs as a coping mechanism, and she developed a dependency on heroin, which quickly spiraled out of control. Paul said that she would do sex work purely as a means to earn enough money to buy more drugs. It was like a never-ending cycle for her that she couldn't break. Despite the family attempting to help her many times, her mother even paid for her to go to rehab, which, it did work for a short time. But after 3 months, she was back again using and working the streets in order to fund her habit. By the summer of 2009, she'd been in this cycle of selling sex on the streets and battling her drug addiction for a number of years. She was actively trying to break free of this addiction, which had been controlling her life, and she'd started on a course of methadone. And it was during one afternoon, after she'd gone to the chemist to get her prescription filled, that her family became concerned when they couldn't reach her. They had tried calling her mobile phone, and multiple times she hadn't answered, she hadn't called them back. And this was quite out of character for Susan. Despite her lifestyle and her drug habit, she had always made a point of keeping in touch with her mother, at the very least. After 24 hours, the family called the police and they reported her missing. But despite launching a thorough investigation, no leads were uncovered. Police teams checked the local area, they spoke door to door with people, and they even ended up dredging Manningham Park Lake and also searching the woodland close by. They spoke with other women in Bradford, in the red light district, and launched a campaign to publicise Susan's disappearance, with posters and even with a TV appeal where her son asked people directly to report any information that they had about where she might be or who might have seen her last. It came out that records revealed that Susan's mobile phone and bank cards had remained unused since the day of her disappearance, which was, obviously of great concern. As days passed into weeks, the family began to lose hope. Susan's brother Paul went to the streets where she usually worked and asked several of the sex workers if they'd known Susan or if they'd heard anything about her from her. One of the women he spoke with was 31-year-old Shelley Armitage. Now, Shelley had been working in the area for some time too, and it was said that her reasons for turning to prostitution echoed Susan's. Darrell Armitage, Shelley's father, said that she was a bright, bubbly girl, someone who was kind and wouldn't hesitate in helping anyone. She started experimenting with drugs, unfortunately, and she was only 16 when she became addicted to heroin. Her sister Gemma said that she'd turned to sex work, much like Susan, as a way of funding her drug addiction. And although she'd tried to hide this from her family for as long as possible so that they wouldn't worry, they'd heard rumours and confronted her eventually. They were obviously very concerned about her well-being and safety, given that she would meet regular clients and also complete strangers most nights. Almost a year after Susan Rushworth had been reported missing, Shelley stopped returning her calls. When it became apparent that nobody could get in contact with her by the evening, her boyfriend rang the police. After 24 hours had passed, and she'd failed to collect her regular benefit payment too, the family were concerned that something was really wrong, and they called again to insist that the police take this really seriously. Her sister Gemma said that she had this intense feeling that something bad had happened, and the family spent day and night on the streets looking for answers. Susan and Shelley were now both missing. Both had been working the same area, hadn't known each other, but there'd been no sightings reported of either of them. 2 weeks after Shelley's disappearance, police released footage of her last known whereabouts, CCTV images of her walking along Sunbridge Road in Bradford. And officers hoped, obviously, that it might jog someone's memory, but nobody came forward. Suzanne Blamires was another sex worker operating in the same area as Susan Rushworth and Shelley Armitage. She was 36 years old. Her mother had said that Suzanne described her daily routine as being like on a relentless merry-go-round. She said, "I get up, I go out to earn enough money to pay for the drugs I need, and repeat." So it seems that she too was stuck in the same cycle of addiction and prostitution to fund her habit. She'd been introduced to drugs around 20 or 21 years of age. She was also an outgoing, confident girl. She enjoyed meeting up with friends to go drinking and dancing all night. When her mother discovered that she'd been using heroin, she said that she was devastated. The family tried everything to get her to stop, and on one occasion even went as far as locking her in the house to prevent her going out and using. Eventually, when her mother sat her down and asked her where she was getting the money to buy these drugs, Suzanne admitted to working in the red light district. Her family were extremely worried, but despite their best efforts, Suzanne's addiction was out of control. On May the 22nd, 2010, Suzanne's mother Nikki was surprised when her boyfriend knocked at her door, asking whether she'd seen her. Now, Nikki had dropped Suzanne back at her own flat the previous morning, but she hadn't spoken to her on the phone that night as they'd planned. She said she felt immediately that something was wrong, and they wasted no time in going to the police and reporting her missing. So now we've got 3 women, all sex workers, within the space of a year, all gone missing without a trace from the same area. And just as police were preparing to launch their search for Suzanne, they received disturbing evidence that would shock even the most experienced detective. Homefield Court is a block of flats in a converted mill in the middle of the red light district. The building's caretaker is routinely viewing footage from the CCTV cameras from the previous 48 hours when he discovers something truly horrifying. He immediately contacted the police. The footage shows Suzanne Blamires following a man along the corridor and into a flat. Only moments later, she runs out of the flat and back down the corridor, pursued by the same man. He was seen carrying a loaded crossbow, and he fires once at Suzanne, missing. But then he pushes her to the ground and reloads, and he shoots her again in the head at close range, Then he drags her by the feet along the floor back into his flat, before returning and walking boldly up to the CCTV camera and sticking his middle finger up. Police immediately swooped on Homefield Court to arrest this suspect. But who was this man? And had he really come out of nowhere? Stephen Griffiths was a 40-year-old local man. When officers arrived at his flat, he was calm and he made no attempt to flee. In fact, he called out, "I'm here," as if he'd been expecting them. And then he added, "I'm Osama bin Laden. This is the end of the line for me." So he was born in 1969, the first child to a food salesman named Stephen and a receptionist, Moira. His parents divorced when he was 13, leaving him and his siblings with his mother, whom he eventually ended up resenting. He was bright and was educated, at least in part, at a private school where he'd won a scholarship to study. However, as a teenager, he would shoplift. And on one occasion, he slashed a shop manager's face with a knife after he'd attempted to prevent Stephen from stealing. The man needed 19 stitches in his face. Now, Stephen was only 17, and he was charged and sentenced to 3 years in youth custody. And during that time in prison, he almost completely lost contact with his family. He told probation officers and psychiatrists that he fantasized about becoming a serial killer. After serving that 3 years, upon his release, he moved into a flat in Manningham, and he enrolled in a psychology course at Bradford College. In 1989, he was found to be in possession of an air pistol. He didn't have a license for this. He was sentenced to 100 hours of community service. He did use the pistol to shoot birds, which he would then take pleasure in dissecting. He would also mutilate animals, cutting the ears and the tails of dogs, and on one occasion throwing a sack containing kittens into a river. A year later, he was sentenced to 2 years in prison for holding a knife to a young girl's throat and threatening her. Following his subsequent release, he began to read and collect many, many books about serial killers. And he studied, in particular, the cases of Jack the Ripper, the Moors murderers, the acid bath murderer, and his favourite obsession was the Yorkshire Ripper, Peter Sutcliffe. He claimed that he was going to do better than Sutcliffe, who in his opinion had made many mistakes. In 1998, he began dating a woman for 2 years, but the relationship ended abruptly when he eventually invited her back to his flat, and she found several disturbing things that raised red flags immediately. I mean, for one, his extensive collection of serial killer books and an assortment of knives on display. And secondly, every single surface covered in plastic. Starting in 2001, Griffiths began to take drugs and drink heavily. He cultivated this weird image, wearing a long black leather trench coat and slicking back his ponytail with baby oil. He had a pair of 4-foot-long monitor lizards as pets, and he would walk around the estate with them on leads. Anyway, at this time in the area, there was also a large goth community, and Stephen tried to fit into this. However, he was branded an uncool goth and a tryhard. One of his neighbours reported visiting his flat and remembers Stephen feeding live baby rats to his lizards. In 2003, he'd got his bachelor's degree in psychology and enrolled at the University of Bradford on a PhD course. But if we return to where we left the story, the police, whilst having an initial confession from Griffiths, or then pariah at any rate, didn't have any physical evidence. There was no sign of Suzanne Blamires at Griffiths' flat. Police only had the CCTV of Suzanne, and then subsequent footage of Stephen carrying other items out of his flat. bin liners and various bags. On May the 25th, 4 days after Suzanne's disappearance, a member of the public discovered a black rucksack floating in the river Aire. The bag contained Suzanne's head, and shockingly, there was still a crossbow bolt embedded in her skull. An investigation team was sent to the area, and that stretch of river thoroughly searched. By this time, the media was starting to take notice, and there were stories coming out about the possibility of a serial murderer in Bradford, talking about the other missing women, and drawing parallels between this case and the Yorkshire Ripper murders in the 1970s. As more body parts were recovered from the river, Griffiths made further confessions to the police. When asked whether he'd murdered Susan Rushworth and Shelley Armitage, he said yes to both. Now, the families of the women initially held out some hope that he was lying or a fantasist, but DNA testing quickly confirmed that a part of one of the remains taken from the river had belonged to Shelley. His desperate need for attention was also evident the first time he appeared at Bradford Magistrates' Court, where he was charged with the murder of the 3 women. When asked to confirm his name, he announced, "My name is the crossbow cannibal." At the conclusion of the trial, Stephen was handed 3 life sentences for killing Susan, Shelley, and Suzanne. The judge said that he would never be released. Since his detainment, he's been continuing to try and exert his control by attempting suicide and by going on hunger strike on several occasions. So that is the conclusion of the case of Stephen Griffiths and the Bradford murders. If you found this case to be interesting or informative, please leave a comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this case. And also, don't forget to click on the subscribe button if you'd like to see future videos. And I'll see you in the next one. Bye.